the channel's objective is towards secular humanism in the Middle East, so that's quite an objective, but we'll see. So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Dennett, for meeting with me today. The first thing I want to talk about is philosophy. We talked about the tradition that you belong to, which is the American pragmatism. A lot of scientists, a lot of kind of look down on philosophy. They think that or what they claim that philosophy lost its purpose, like Stephen Hawking, Professor Dawkins. What's your thoughts? What is the proper introduction to philosophy as you see it?
Well, I think a lot of philosophy did lose its purpose. But if you go back a few hundred years, you see that at that point, philosophers were collaborators with scientists, and often scientists themselves. And they helped create the field of economics. They helped create the field of psychology. They helped create the field of physics. And people like Hume and Adam Smith were serious thinkers who were up to date on the science of the day, and John Locke, and on the continent, of course, Descartes and Leibniz were scientists themselves. And so I think that we're returning to that excellent era in Anglophone philosophy, at least one large part of it, because we're taking on the task of negotiating the very difficult chasms between the world of everyday things, the world of that we all grow up in, and the scientific world. Are colors real? Are things really solid? Does free will exist? Is consciousness material or immaterial? These questions have always had one foot in science, but also one foot in everyday conviction and intuition. And the philosopher's job is to knit the two together. And if you do that right, you have to know the science, and you have to know what everyday people think their concepts mean. And then you can work on the job of how to marry the everyday non-scientific concepts to the scientific. And the questions are difficult, they're conceptual, and very often they don't have answers to discover or to demonstrate so much as ways of presenting things, expository strategies, even you might say diplomacy, pedagogy, where you teach different sides how to talk to each other instead of trying to define the terms of one and the terms of the other, because that exercise of definition is usually doesn't bear fruit.
And do you see it as benign, or do you see it that it's useless, or what's the other branch of philosophy that you were referring to?
Well, I think the branch that I'm in is very useful, and I take particular pleasure when I encounter scientists who have run into that and discovered, oh yes, we really need some help here from the philosophers. And it does happen, and they are often chastised and even a bit embarrassed when they realize that. But there is a whole lot of philosophy which is just obscurantist and ideological and fancy talk. And I think that is, I think that's useless. I also think that, I actually think that some of the practitioners of that I don't think they should sleep well at night, because they seduce really brilliant minds into wasting their lives doing this silly legerdemain of the mind, which is that may entertain each other, but they're not accomplishing anything.
I get where you're talking about. This is exactly the experience that I went through, shifting from religious dogmatism to fancy talk and the deepities of these branches of philosophy, and it was a waste of energy. I think I've wasted like almost 10 years of my life. It helps with self-criticism, but I don't think it's objective, and it's going somewhere. In your basically the most important work that most people think that it's one of the books that we in cognitive science and philosophy that we mandatory reading, which is Consciousness Explained. Can you give us a brief explanation on consciousness and how does belief fall into that?
Consciousness is a huge puzzle because it's both too familiar to us, very familiar to us. We think we know nothing better than our own consciousness. And yet when we look at it from the scientific point of view, when we look at somebody's brain, we don't see anything that reminds us of human consciousness. And seeing how these two can fit together is it's a feat of the imagination, which we're making progress on slowly, and eventually I think we'll solve it. But it's so hard that some people just declare it impossible. Well, I think they're giving up early, and they're defeatists, and excuse me. So how do you go about explaining the way consciousness fits into the scientific world? I have claimed that you do it from the scientific point of view by building up to it. From the third person point of view, we start with, if you like, simple living things. Start with plants, start with bacteria. And they don't seem to be conscious, but they're sentient. They're sensitive, and they respond adaptively to things. And you get a good understanding of what the economy of their design is and what their talents, what their competences are. And as we move up and through into the animals, the multicellular animals, we see more and more competences, and we see the competences knit together, coalesced, organized in more and more intelligent ways. And we gradually build up to the point where it strikes us that, wait, we're conscious, they're conscious. And it's interesting that mistakes can be made. A termite colony has been seen by some observers, some careful observers of termites, as itself, the whole colony, as a conscious agent. The Soul of the White Ant is the title of one of these books. And for not bad reasons, because there's a lot of coordination and organization. And taking a step into another part of the living world, if you look at say Portuguese man-o-war jellies, that's actually a colony. And there are other animals which are really made up of lots of smaller animals. Yeah. And you start scratching your head, well, how many consciousnesses here, if any? I say, don't assume that consciousness is one thing which is either there or not, because at the end of that path lies worrying about the consciousness of a protein or the consciousness of France. Yeah. And there is something to be said in each case. I mean, there's competences there. There's group competences and micro competences. But it's better just to set aside the term consciousness and look at the competences and see how they build. And eventually, I claim, you get to our beloved kind of consciousness from this bottom-up third-person point of view, and you realize, oh, that's what I am. I'm one of those.
So it's not through anthropomorphism, right?
Well, anthropomorphism is an interesting and delicate concept in that there's benign anthropomorphism. There are things in the world which are well treated as agents with agendas, as having interests, as gathering information and acting reasonably on the basis of that information. And the things that are so treated, which I call them intentional systems, are various. They include some artifacts, some computers, some robots. They include termite colonies. They include corporations. They include nations sometimes. So the principle that only anthropos should be anthropomorphized, only human beings, and maybe only adult human beings, that's what anchors the concept of an agent. But it isn't or shouldn't be seen as the privileged and only referent for the term.
Yeah. It reminds me of one of my favorite lines in Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. You tell for almost a page, you keep on talking about the development of evolution and how we colonize Earth, we reach the moon, and you say that finally the universe has reached the development of its neural system, I think, or something like that.
Our planet has its neural system.
Yeah, yes. I think it was a very poetic line. You are a student of, you used to be a student of the great philosopher Quine.
Yes.
How was that experience?
It was wonderful. I had two great teachers in philosophy. One was Quine, and one was the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle in Oxford, who was my thesis supervisor. And I am not embarrassed to say that the influence of both my teachers on my work is manifest, and I view it with gratitude. From Quine, I got his pragmatism and his conviction that if philosophy was going to be worth doing, it was going to be a branch, a peripheral branch of science. It was going to join forces with science and deal with problems with the same respect for objectivity, for reason, for materialism, and he was something of a pioneer in that, developed it further than other pragmatists. And I bought that, and I also eventually came around to many aspects of his theory of meaning, which I initially fought like a tiger.
You describe yourself in one of the books as an anti-Quinian when you were I forgot the book.
Yeah, when I went off to Oxford as a graduate student, I thought I was the great anti-Quinian. I had spent 3 years as an undergraduate doing battle with Quine and trying to show what he was wrong about. When I got to Oxford, I discovered I accepted more of Quine than anybody else did, and I found myself defending Quine on most occasions. So I was the village Quinean, that slowly dawned on me. It's not a bad way of developing your views, actually.
That's the beauties of the scientific method. Like in religion, nothing like that can ever happen, especially where I come from, where conformity is part of, it's not even knowledge based, but conformity that I'm telling you, you follow what I tell you, therefore we got this continuity of this knowledge. And I'm interested about the web of belief and how can we apply that theory on religion and religious belief? Is there a way to do that, in your opinion?
So Quine's idea of the web of belief is that if you go around the world, look and get everybody together, around the periphery there's beliefs that we all share because they're very directly related to our senses, to our, he would say, sensory stimulation. So that there's a cup on the table, that the sky is blue, that there's grass growing in the field. All these everyday factual matters, objective matters, everybody's going to believe those in common. And then we're going to have interpretations and theories of them, which develop, which move away from the given, from the immediate evidence of our senses, in ways that open up possibilities of indeterminacy, where you might have two people that had apparently different theories. And then if you look much more closely, you might discover, well, actually, you can translate one theory into the other just fine. They're just using terms differently. They're just notational variants. But then you might also discover a deeper kind of difference between two theories and want to know, well, is one of them true and one of them false? And one of the great insights of Quine was that in the limit, don't expect there to be a final fact of the matter about what the true truth is about everything, which set of propositions at the center of the web of belief is right, and as opposed to all the others. There could be, as it were, a tie for first place, and there would be no way of settling that. Now, that's a very uncomfortable idea for most people, and most philosophers, I have to say. When they encounter it, they think about it for a while, and they decide that Quine is just embracing a paradox, that can't be true. But I have maintained for years, Quine was right about that. And why don't we encounter this then? Well, because the odds against this happening are astronomical, because the constraints that would have to be met by two different theories so that they could both be accurate about the world and be different. The constraints are just too many. My parallel for this is a crossword puzzle that I devised, which has two solutions. And I give it to my students, and they get both solutions. They don't realize. I ask them to solve it and hand it in, and they do, and then I find out that some of them find one, some of them find the other. Each of them think they found the only solution. In general, you think if you find a solution to a crossword puzzle, you found the solution. There's only one. But it's possible, difficult, but possible for there to be two solutions equally good. And that's what Quine is saying about the grand theories of the world. Don't make the theoretical mistake of insisting that there has to be one true truth about everything. It might be like that although there is just one settled truth about things, just as in general crossword puzzles have just one solution, don't think of this as, don't think you have the obligation to prove that there can only be one. That's all it is.
And the element of the web, is it justified belief, or it's not limited to justified belief?
Well, it is justified in some fairly mild sense of justified, yes.
Okay.
Inference to the best explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it explains the commitment to belief, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what makes me fascinated.
Yeah,
about
but
it.
then when you look at religious belief, you find that here the situation is importantly different, because religious belief is really cut off from the peripheries in an interesting way. If an anthropologist goes into the wild and encounters a tribe that hasn't been studied before, and he has to learn the language from scratch. Quine has a wonderful thought experiment about this, but I'm going to push it in a different direction here. Translation proceeds, and eventually the anthropologist thinks he or she's got a pretty good handle on the language. And if the question at issue is that bridge safe to walk across? Or is this food safe to eat? Or are there antelopes in the glade? Well, you can go and check. But if it's the religious beliefs that you're encountering, and several anthropologists have noted this, you find you don't know whether they mean it or not. You don't, and there's no way of testing it. The beliefs are cut off. They're systematically cut off from confirmation. That's the whole point of religious beliefs, is that they're impossible to confirm or disconfirm.
Yeah.
And what I think is important is that if you think of a small child growing up in a culture, is actually in the same position as the anthropologist. You hear the elders saying these things, and you think you're not sure you understand them, but the elders all say it's very important. You gotta believe this, and you go through your whole life. You never know what they mean by them for sure. You never know whether they really believe them, and it's the nature of religious belief that you can't.
I think Islam has turned into a very special case, that the Muslim communities or the Muslim world has turned into a different level of controlling reality, where right now we see the Muslim clerics and leaders, they have a tendency to control reality. It's not even about their belief. It's about the reality should conform to what they think, or to the scripture. As an example, and I think governments has played a big role on that. The example is, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, where you see throughout the years, TVs, radio, all of these things, they had to get these religious leaders, mainly from the desert, and get their confirmation on the principle. That's something that exists already. And they had to go through a process to, let's say, like if it's a radio, they had to play the Quran on the radio to prove that it's not magic. And I don't think that such a case...
How does that prove it's not magic?
Exactly. It doesn't prove or disprove anything.
Yeah.
But it's that level that makes me concerned, and in some way it confirms their apocalyptic fantasies that we talked about a month ago, where if it didn't confirm, it might all just go down the drain because it's not working to us. And if you allow me to go back to consciousness and how does belief or if it does occupy space in our consciousness, how if you can explain to us, how does that work?
I'm not quite sure what question you're asking. If you're, first of all, as a default position, whatever you're conscious of, you believe you're conscious of. That is to say, if somebody asks you, "Hey, what are you conscious of?" you say, "Oh, right now I was thinking about China." And what you say is something you believe. And in fact, it's very hard to imagine how you could be wrong about that. But that doesn't mean you couldn't, but it's generally assumed that it's just about impossible to be wrong about the very contents of your consciousness. So that means you have a lot of true beliefs about your consciousness. Is consciousness made of beliefs? Well, no, it's made of episodes. It's made of contentful episodes, but those aren't so much beliefs as imaginings and perceivings. And but then perceiving is a sort of belief generating. I have a paper called "Seeing is Believing," or is it? And I think it's important to realize that there is a sense in which perceiving is believing, seeing is believing. You haven't told the whole story of perception if you end up just at something you call an experience. You want to know what beliefs are generated that are then acted upon.
I was talking specifically about religious belief,
Yeah.
and the reason is I'm trying to understand, or at least the viewers can understand, some of the impacts that religious, specifically Islamic religious ideologies, has been operating on. The example that I have in mind is, for instance, is the Arabic language the Quran. The Arabic language conforms to the Quran. Well, what happens is the Arabic language was set by the yardstick of the Quran. So I'm thinking maybe that might have a significant impact on how we see things, and it's a limitation of our mental capabilities, isn't it?
Could be. It's a possibility in principle. I don't know how likely it is that that's true. Certainly, our language, whatever language we speak, whatever languages we speak, enables by constraining. It makes some things easy to say and to think about, and some things hard to say and to think about. And between different languages, there's some pretty palpable differences. That's before we get into the Whorfian hypothesis and sort of deep differences in cognition. There may be some deep differences in cognition. There are certainly, that is in cognitive mechanisms, cognitive habits, there certainly are differences in sort of conceptual scheme and how people think of things, yes.
That's, they say it's a miracle. It's a linguistic miracle that they cannot prove anything wrong in the Quran linguistically. What they don't say is that actually the Arabic language confirms that the tribes got together and they say that the yardstick that we use for the Arabic language, not the other dialects or the other languages from different regions. The Quran is the yardstick, and it's like some kind of a logical fallacy that in application here.
And is the Arabic that is spoken in the Arab-speaking world uniformly Quranic Arabic?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
But with different, there's some words that are different and added, right?
Yeah, but
and different accents.
Yeah, but the language and the rules of syntax is based on the Quran, the rules of the Quran, and there's the dialects of the Quran, and that's the approved syntax in how the grammar and everything, and whatever does not conform to that is wrong. So it's kind of a secular, kind of a vicious circle that they.
Well, I don't know. Let's see. It used to be that in Great Britain, BBC English, British Broadcasting Corporation English, was considered the standard bearer. This was the litmus test for English. And that's what was taught, and people aspired to pronounce words the way the BBC did, and the result was that you got a very sort of highbrow, plummy language.
Yeah.
The BBC abandoned that. Now, if you listen to the BBC, you hear Cockney accents and Irish accents and all kinds of accents, and that's diversity is tolerated and celebrated. So, but even at the height of this, it affected pronunciation and it affected grammar, but I don't think it necessarily affected doctrine or ideology in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but you seem to be making the strong claim that the anchoring Arabic in the Quran has an ideological constraint built into it.
Yes, yeah, that it is.
It might be.
Yeah.
I don't know.
In Arabic, that's what they teach us. It's part of the claim that the Quran is infallible, that you cannot find a mistake, a linguistical mistake. I'm not going to get into the scientific proofs that you get also in the Bible that looking for seeking for confirmation.
So this is like the people that say that the Bible is the literal truth about everything.
Yeah, that's
the same.
In the Bible, in Christianity at least, you'll find some this variation, but in Islam there is complete consensus that it's absolutely true. Can I one last question? I want to talk about your paper that you recommended that I read, and I thought it was very fascinating, and it was spot on of what I was thinking about. Some background: the religious people usually fall into philosophy, these philosophies that is just fascinating and it's not really objective. You mentioned that science, the scientific method, in some places was claimed to be a Western colonial project, and this is in some way is true. In a lot of ways, if I talk scientifically, they in the Arab world they say that that's a Westerner, he's trying to be Western. Can you talk a little bit about that as a notion?
It's there's a sort of deep conflict in the ideology here, because on the one hand you have one group of apologists saying the West stole science from Islam, and the great mathematicians and astronomers were Arabic speakers and were followers of Islam, and then the West took it over.
So we're not. I'm just gonna intrude over here. They're mostly atheists, but living in the Muslim world.
Yeah,
I think that's a claim.
But and there was a great flowering of mathematical thought and even scientific thought in the Arab world back in the early days, and then it was really squelched. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a scholar of that, but I know about that historical fact that this was very vigorously discouraged. Yeah. And so the West went charging ahead with science. And of course, it wasn't just in the Arab world, and to some degree out in the Asian world, in China. There was a similar stultification where they lost a lot of ground. They had been leading the West in many areas of science and technology, and then they fell way back, and now they're catching up.
Yeah.
I think there are, on the one hand, the obvious geopolitical facts. Look at the universities, look at the Nobel Prizes, look at the where the progress comes in these areas, and tends to come in the Western world, and certainly not in the Arabic world.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I read recently, and you'll tell me if it was accurate, was that very few books from the West are translated into Arabic and published in Arab translations. I think more books are published in Italian translations in Italy in a month than are published in Arabic translations in the whole Arab world in a year. And why is that? It's a very striking fact that for various reasons, the Arab world seems to block its eyes and ears to a lot of what's coming from the West.
It's true. It's absolutely true, and because of the governments. But I think the conditions are changing. I think the youth are, with the internet, they have a massive thirst for knowledge. Just another interesting fact that you might find it interesting, that the majority of the books translated in Arabic are either cooking books or dream interpretation books. That's the big chunk of the books that are sold in the that sells specifically in Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries, the Gulf countries, are dream interpretation books, and it's like these pseudosciences that people usually buy into it. But they're on the positive side. I think the conditions are changing.
So do I. I think, and in fact, I will be so bold as to say it may not require Arabic translation.
Yeah.
That is, the thirst for information may be such that young Arabs are going to learn English, and they're going to learn it through the internet. And I do not see any way for authoritarian governments to halt that, short of imprisoning their people. I think that the floodgates are opening, and let cooking books and dream interpretation books lead the way. Let movies and blue jeans and comic books lead the way. Every last bit of it is, as the authoritarians believe, it's subversive. And if you try to keep it all out, then you're just consigning yourself to complete isolation and backwardness. And once you let it in, it'll take a time, and it'll be misused and misinterpreted. One of the things, maybe you have some insight into this. One of the things that has fascinated me is that, to a greater degree than I would have thought possible, one can filter out most of Western ways of thought and still import technical knowledge. How to fix an automobile engine, how to fly a jet, how to pump oil. Technical information can be absorbed. One can become an engineer, and yet not really imbibe in the ways and methods and attitudes of Western thinking. That surprises me.
I feel it exactly the same way. We have a lot of people who are successful scientists and doctors, and they still believe in a lot of the stuff that you hear from mystical person that is pretty much the antithesis of the scientific method. He still believed that as an example, I'm referring to a conversation that I had with a doctor, a neuroscientist. He's a psychologist in Canada, and he still believes that God plays a big role in the way we behave, and it was very surprising to me. Like, how can that be?
Yes, I've learned that one mustn't jump to conclusions. The capacity to compartmentalize your mind is greater than I would have thought.
Yeah. Well, any final remarks from your side?
No, I applaud what you're doing. I wish you the best of luck. I'm delighted to learn that you can do this openly, not anonymously. I know that in some quarters, apostasy is seen as a terrible crime, and I think that's one of the most objectionable features of the Islamic world. Yeah. And I know a lot of people are afraid, and I applaud you for setting a shining example.
Thank you very much. It means a lot to me. Dr. Dennett, it was a great pleasure for me to meet one of my heroes, actually. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's a pleasure to learn that I have that role.
Thank you.